Remember the China study, the book that told you animal protein causes cancer? It's been around for years, telling people to avoid meat, dairy, and eggs. But here's the thing. The book is built on very weak correlations and rat studies using powerful chemical carcinogens and a purified milk protein, not what we would call real food. In fact, when you look at whole dairy with its full complement of protein and its healthy fats like CLA and butyrate, the research shows it might actually fight cancer. Other human studies even show people who eat more animal protein live longer and have less chronic disease. The real issue? It's probably not the protein. It's likely refined carbs and insulin spikes that are driving problems like cancer and weight gain.
This is Lecture 104 of the Metabolic Classroom with Dr. Ben Bikman.
Looking to improve your own metabolic health? Visit insuliniq.com for courses, coaching, consultations, and a 10-day free community membership trial. To dive deep into the science behind metabolic health, become an insider at benbikman.com, where you'll enjoy my exclusive content, ad-free podcasts, live stream Q&A access, and more. Welcome to the Metabolic Classroom. I'm Benjamin Bikman, a biomedical scientist and professor of cell biology. Today's lecture is on the topic of a nutritional heavyweight, namely the China study. This is a book that makes the bold and oft-repeated claim that animal protein drives cancer and chronic disease, pushing, therefore, for a plant-based diet. It's been very influential and shaped dietary trends for the better part of 20 years. In the time we spend together today, I want to unpack the correlational data that is the foundation of the China study and the limitations of its animal experiments, especially the claims about dairy protein, and explore how dairy fats may actually fight cancer and, in general, make the case for whole foods. We'll also dive into the mTOR pathway, often blamed for protein's supposed cancer link, and why insulin, perhaps driven by refined carbs, is likely the real culprit. Let's start by just exploring what is the China study. As I noted, it was a book published in 2005, and it draws from a big research project called the China Cornell Oxford Project, and that is a 1980s epidemiological study across 65 rural Chinese counties, surveying about 6,500 people. It paired this with some rat experiments to explore and argue that animal protein promotes cancer and diseases like heart disease and diabetes, and in the end, presenting this other view, advocating a whole food plant-based diet with minimal animal protein. It is a compelling narrative that's inspired many people to adopt a vegan diet, and the intent is pure, to improve health. It's admirable, but as any good scientist notes, correlation is not causation. Just because two things happen together doesn't mean one thing causes the other. The China study leans on correlations completely for all the human evidence, 100%. Then it relies on some animal studies to help explore some of the details. Let's examine where the study falters and why protein, especially when paired with fats and whole foods, deserves a bit more of a fair shake. Now, the China study collected data on hundreds of variables ranging from diet and lifestyle to disease rates, producing a very complex web of correlations. But correlations can be very misleading. This became especially clear to me, particularly through the work of Denise Minger, and I want to give her credit. She vigorously and rigorously dissected the data and highlighted some of the inconsistencies. So a lot of what helped me form some of my initial views that have since been refined come from her. But when we look at the raw findings and the conclusions presented in the book, things do in fact get a little murkier than the book suggests. For example, the book emphasizes a strong link between animal protein and cancer mortality, yet the raw data don't always support this. In fact, total cancer mortality was more strongly correlated with plant protein intake than with animal protein, which often showed no significant or even inverse associations. Remarkably, in some of the regions surveyed, higher meat consumption correlated with lower overall mortality and cancer deaths. a finding that challenges the narrative that animal foods inherently promote disease. There is, in fact, one standout, Touted County. This is one of the counties surveyed in the book. It was a notable outlier that was very lightly discussed. This population consumed large quantities of animal protein, more than double the American average, and derived a high percentage of calories from fat. Yet they experienced low rates of both cancer and heart disease. Now, this doesn't prove that meat prevents disease, but it does call into question the central claims that meat causes it. Other dietary and lifestyle variables, such as income and healthcare access, or even other nutritional variables like refined carbohydrate consumption, certainly act as confounding variables. For example, wheat flour intake showed a much stronger correlation with heart disease, a leading killer, than animal protein did. Likewise, refined carbohydrates and sugar intake were linked with negative health outcomes. Despite this, the book singles out protein, especially animal protein, as the culprit. In other words, based on these same data, a person could write a version of the China study that presented the view that wheat flour causes disease rather than focusing on animal protein. But all of this is an example, perhaps a fancy one, of what is sometimes called the ice cream drowning fallacy. Just because two variables correlate doesn't mean one causes the other. In this case, both ice cream sales and drowning deaths rise in the summer. So think about that. Every summer, you could see that more people are drowning and people are eating a lot of ice cream. Does that mean that the ice cream is causing the drowning? Well, no, of course it doesn't. Just because they share, in this case, a seasonal factor doesn't mean that one is causing the other, but they are certainly correlated. Similarly, eggs might be blamed for disease simply because they're often eaten alongside toast and butter and juice. The China project should be seen as a hypothesis generator, not a definitive guide to dietary causality. Now, speaking of causality, the book cites rat studies to claim animal protein, especially from dairy, promotes cancer. These experiments typically involved feeding rats casein, an isolated milk protein that you've probably heard of, alongside the powerful liver chemical carcinogen aflatoxin. Rats on the high casein diets developed more liver tumors than those on low casein diets, leading to the broad claim that animal protein drives cancer. But that's an oversimplification for a few reasons. But let me just repeat the mechanism that they studied. They gave rats a very powerful chemical carcinogen, and then they gave them casein. And they found that when they gave them casein, the cancer got worse, although it was already substantial because they caused it with this chemical carcinogen. Now, what are a couple of the problems? First, the studies used, in this case, a purified casein. They did not use whole dairy products like milk or cheese. Real dairy, of course, contains fats and vitamins and even other proteins like whey protein, which affect metabolism and even cancer very differently. Feeding rats a single refined protein is like evaluating the effects of sugar by only giving fructose, although it's not like the pure sugar is going to do anything much better. But it's not representative of a normal whole food human diet. In fact, a paper published in 1989 by the same research group showed that whey protein led to significantly fewer precancerous liver lesions in rats than the casein did when both were paired with aflatoxin. So they could have highlighted the relatively more modest effects of whey, but they deliberately chose the more powerful effects of the casein. Second, not all animal proteins behave like casein, even if we are to vilify casein. Fish protein, for instance, has been shown to reduce tumor growth in rodent models, including reduced incidence of mammary tumor, or what we would say is just breast tumor incidence. Beef protein has also been tested in colon cancer models in rats, and high intakes were not associated with increased cancer risk. Moreover, when casein has been tested without the powerful chemical carcinogen aflatoxin or other carcinogens, tumors do not develop spontaneously, implying that the protein itself is not causing the cancer. It's also misleading to paint all plant proteins as protective. Some combinations of plant proteins have promoted tumor growth in similar rodent models, underscoring that cancer risk depends perhaps more on amino acid composition and metabolic context than whether a protein comes from plants or animals. Protein, in general, of course, is a metabolic ally. It's critical for muscle synthesis, appetite regulation, and metabolic things like glucose control and insulin sensitivity. Blaming dairy or all animal protein for cancer based on narrow, artificial models is, we have to admit, nutritionally short-sighted. But let's come back to casein, one of the main dairy proteins. Proteins don't come alone when we eat dairy. They come with fat, protein's best friend. Dairy fats like conjugated linoleic acid, CLA, and butyrate may have, in fact, anti-cancer properties, supporting the case for consuming protein with fat in whole foods. CLA, found in dairy products like butter and cheese, has been studied for its potential to inhibit cancer cell growth. Research has shown that CLA from dairy reduced breast cancer cell proliferation in vitro, so in cell cultures, and in animal models by inducing apoptosis, so programmed cell death, and inhibiting tumor growth pathways. A 2015 meta-analysis published in PLOS ONE found that higher CLA intake from dairy was associated with a lower risk of breast cancer in human observational studies, suggesting a protective effect. Of course, that's the same kind of studies done in the China study. Butyrate, a short-chain fatty acid, also shows some promise. A 1997 study reviewed evidence that butyrate inhibits colon cancer cell growth by promoting cell differentiation and, again, the programmed cell death, what we call apoptosis. And the end result of this was a good inhibition of tumor formation in the same kinds of animal models used. And human studies, like those cited by a 2016 Nature Reviews paper, suggest higher dairy fat intake correlates with lower colorectal cancer risk, partly due to butyrate's anti-inflammatory effects. Now, I just mentioned all of this because these fats highlight why isolating casein, as done in the China study, misses the mark. Whole dairy's nutrient matrix, like all of the fats, all of the proteins, all of the vitamins, works synergistically. It's almost like they were designed to come together. Removing fat, as in low-fat dairy, and isolating individual proteins may strip some of the overall collective and protective compounds, weakening some of the anti-cancer potential. But this aligns with keeping protein and fat together in foods, like whole milk or cheese or yogurt, maximizing the metabolic benefits while potentially reducing the cancer risk. Now, let's leave the world of correlation behind us for a moment and talk mechanism. After all, I am a basic scientist, so I'm uncomfortable with correlation. A common argument against animal protein is that it activates mTOR, a signaling pathway tied to cell growth and potentially cancer. Now, amino acids, especially leucine, which is high in animal proteins like dairy and meat, stimulate mTOR, raising concerns about tumor growth. But this vastly oversimplifies things. And more importantly, there are stronger stimuli that activate mTOR. In other words, if mTOR matters for cancer, and that is a big if, then we should be working to find what is the most powerful stimulus of mTOR. A central argument in discussions of protein and cancer risk centers on the activation of mTOR, that master regulator of cell growth and proliferation. Some claim that leucine or the animal proteins dangerously overstimulate this pathway. However, a close look at the study by Gran and Cameron Smith in 2011 reveals a more nuanced picture. The researchers compared how leucine and insulin individually and jointly affect mTOR activation over time. They found that leucine transiently stimulated mTOR phosphorylation or activation with a modest 1.3-fold increase, so about a 30% increase at 30 minutes. And importantly, this signal or mTOR activation had faded by 3 hours and was still absent completely at 24 hours. In contrast, insulin's effect on mTOR was both stronger and much more sustained, producing a 2-fold increase in phosphorylation at 3 hours and maintaining a significant 1.5-fold activation even 24 hours later. Let me say that all again. So when they looked at leucine, the most powerful mTOR stimulating amino acid, it only increased mTOR at the 30-minute time point. But insulin increased it even more at the 30-minute time point by about 3 times more than leucine did, and it maintained that activation for 24 hours. In fact, it could have gone even longer. It's just that the scientists stopped measuring at 24 hours. This finding has critical implications. If chronic mTOR activation is truly a concern for cancer risk, as some hypothesize, then insulin, not leucine or other components of an animal protein, may be the more potent and persistent stimulator. In other words, hyperinsulinemia driven by refined carbohydrates or insulin resistance may pose a much more meaningful threat than eating steak or eggs or milk. Leucine may flick the mTOR switch briefly, but insulin holds it on. Thus, framing animal protein as uniquely dangerous while ignoring insulin's dominant influence on mTOR is pretty misleading and even metabolically myopic. The China study sidesteps this. Its rat studies didn't explore insulin's role, fixating on casein. Yet human data, like a 2022 paper published on the Nurses' Health Study, found diets high in insulinemic potential, like rich and refined carbs and sugary drinks, linked to a 15% higher breast cancer risk, especially ER-negative tumors. Their empirical dietary index for hyperinsulinemia, a metric that they used, showed high-carb processed foods elevate C-peptide, a marker of insulin secretion, tying back to mTOR. This suggests insulin, not protein, drives cancer risk. But again, that's correlational data. And as we near the end, let's fight fire with fire. If the China study uses correlational human evidence to suggest protein causes cancer, are there correlational studies that fail to show such an effect? A 2018 study in European Journal of Nutrition found no link at all between animal protein and cancer, with fish and poultry showing, in fact, protective effects. Carr et al. In 2016 found no consistent link with red meat when controlling for lifestyle factors like smoking or other processed food consumption. The In-Chianti study is a standout, and it's one I hope you'll look up and read after. This 20-year cohort of over 1,100 older Italians found animal protein intake was associated with lower all-cause mortality, including even cardiovascular mortality. In fact, this study suggests animal protein's amino acid profile and nutrient density, like eggs, fish, dairy, support longevity, not disease. It's a direct counter to the China study's claims and highlights protein's role in supporting muscle and health in older adults. Another 2022 study found higher total meat intake was associated with greater life expectancy across 175 distinct populations. And there are many more studies that suggest the same. So what does this mean for you? I have some friendly suggestions as your friendly neighborhood scientist. First, don't fear animal protein, especially in whole foods. Eggs, salmon, beef, and full-fat dairy provide amino acids, nutrients, and very beneficial fats like CLA and butyrate that may fight cancer. The In-Chianti study shows animal protein's protective role in older adults, supporting muscle and longevity. Second, I suggest, as always, control carbs. Choose whole food carbs, leafy greens and berries, not bread or juice. In other words, don't get your carbs from bags and boxes with barcodes. This keeps insulin low, supporting metabolic health, and likely keeping cancer risk low. Third, question bold claims. The China study's correlations in the biased animal studies, including overstated dairy risks, don't justify demonizing protein. Remember, work from that very group also showed that a more complete dairy mix was less tumorigenic or cancer promoting when given the chemical carcinogen than casein was in the rats. Refined carbs, with their robust and sustained insulin spikes, are likely far more relevant to cancer. As I mentioned earlier, based solely on the data provided in the China study's human evidence, a person could have made the case that a meat-based diet is best. In the end, the China study absolutely sparked a movement, but its science is shaky. Its correlations are inconsistent, and the animal studies, including those with dairy, or one specific dairy protein, do not translate to humans. And it totally ignores the metabolic aspect of insulin's role. Studies like in Chianti show animal protein supports longevity, albeit correlationally, while dairy fats like CLA and butyrate may in fact fight cancer. Refined carbs, not protein, are consistently shown to drive insulin and mTOR, supposed mechanisms and triggers for cancer, thus making them likely culprits if any part of our nutrition should be blamed or scrutinized. Thanks for listening to the Metabolic Classroom. Share this episode and keep exploring nutrition with a very critical eye. Remember, more knowledge, better health. Looking to improve your own metabolic health? Visit InsulinIQ.com for courses, coaching, consultations, and a 10-day free community membership trial. To dive deep into the science behind metabolic health, become an insider at BenBikman.com, where you'll enjoy my exclusive content, ad-free podcasts, live stream Q&A access, and more.